All right, let's come back now. We're going to have a look at the second step in the case model, what they refer to as abilities. So thinking about the strengths and the barriers to learning or functional impacts for everyone in our classroom and specific individuals with disability and diverse learning needs. So let's have a look at that second part before we look at how we can do it. So the A part of the model, this being the new graphic, as said before, I prefer the old model. So we're going to look at this A element, thinking about, everything that we know about our students. In the documentation from ACARA, it talks about adjusting teaching and learning programs, taking into account students' interests, their general capabilities, area content, and so forth. And we'll have a look at how we can do that. So fundamentally, we're thinking about that response to intervention model now, tier 1 being whole class, tier 2 being small groups, tier 3 being individual. So when we're thinking about the A part of the model, we actually got to think about everyone in our class as well as individuals. So let's have a look at the steps that we follow for implementing this A part of the model. So we've got to first start by identifying the common characteristics, strengths, and barriers for our whole class. Then we apply the Universal Design for Learning framework to the strengths and the barriers to learning for everyone in our classroom. Once we've done that and looked at the Universal Design for Learning framework, it's simply a problem-solving tool. It's not a set of strategies. Then we identify strategies that will work for everyone in our classroom. When we think about the tier 2 and tier 3, we're thinking about individual students. Now we think about what are the individual characteristics and barriers to learning for specific students with disability and diverse learning needs. Then we think about the possible instructional, environmental, and the curriculum adjustments that we can put in place for those students. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through that process and we'll get you to give it a go as well. So let's start with the tier 1. We'll start with the whole class. So the first thing we need to do when we think about a whole class, we need to move away from that model of thinking about individual students. We're thinking about everyone we see in, let's say, class of 30 students. We're thinking about what are the common characteristics that we see in our classes. In my class at school, I've got varying levels of literacy. I've got kids who really struggle with literacy all the way through to kids who are very competent at literacy. So I've got varying levels of literacy and I've got varying levels of engagement. I've got kids who are disengaged all the way through to kids who are highly engaged in the learning process. So in this tier 1, part of the case model, I'm thinking about what are the common characteristics. I use the term varying levels because if I say low levels of literacy, it's automatically negative and it's hard to think about strengths. Or if I got disengaged as a common characteristic, it's really hard to think about strengths associated with those groups. So now that I've identified common characteristics of groups of kids in my classroom, I'm going to think about what are the strengths. So for kids with varying levels of literacy, I've got kids who are with excellent memory, great with technology, kids who are creative, and kids who are good visual literacy, because we know that kids who struggle with literacy often have very good visual literacy as a compensatory mechanism. With varying levels of engagement in classroom, I've got kids who are creative, hands-on learner, hyper-focused when engaged, demonstrate leadership skills, able to find creative shortcuts, easily bored with repetitive practice. So now we've identified the strengths, we now need to think about the potential functional impact or barriers to learning. This is the definition of functional impact from the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability. So kids with varying levels of literacy, we've got the strengths, but we've also got the barriers to learning. Low self-esteem, difficulties reading text, difficulty comprehending the meaning of text, and with others, and varying levels of engagement. Same. We've identified the strengths and now the barriers to learning. In the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability, it states that not all students with disability require an individual learning plan. Remember, individual systems and schools have their own policies around that. But one way to demonstrate functional impact for students with disability in that nationally consistent collection of data might be putting the initials of students' disability next to their functional impacts. So what I want you to do now, I want you to go back to your Word document. I want you to draw up this table, and I want you to think about your classroom. And I want you to think about what are common characteristics that you might see in your students, and what might be some of the associated strengths, and what might be some of the associated barriers to learning for your students. We're going to do that for 10 minutes. So go to your Word document. I'm going to leave this up to give you some ideas, but I want you to think about your classroom. You might have the common characteristics that I have here, but your strengths and barriers to learning might be different. So I want you to now draw up the table, and I'll give it a go for your students in your classroom. If you don't teach class, but you support a classroom, think about the classroom you support. If you're an educational leader, think about a classroom that you know of and give that a go. Or think back to when you were in a classroom and do it for a class that you had. I'll put 10 minutes on the timer and we'll come back, and then we'll have a look at the next step of developing strategies for this whole class, and then we'll move into individual students with disability and diverse learning needs. So I'll put 10 minutes on, and I'll come back in 10 minutes. Two more minutes and we'll come back. All right, let's come back, everyone. So in a part of the case model, we're thinking about what are the strengths and the barriers to learning for our students, the whole class, as well as moving into individual students with disability and diverse learning needs. So using this table, we've identified what are the common characteristics, associated strengths for a whole class and associated barriers to the learning process. Notice we're not thinking about individual students yet. We've used initials here in the nationally consistent collection of data to show that we've identified the barriers to learning for our students with disability within our whole class. So as we start to move into thinking about strategies, there are a number of different pedagogical approaches to use that can be used. I like universal design for learning because it's named by ATIL and the nationally consistent collection of data as an approach in Australia, but there are many different approaches. We'll just have a look at universal design for learning and how it can be used, but you could use other approaches as well. This is the universal design for learning framework. It looks like a lot, but it's not really. No teacher could do it all, and that's not the way it's really designed. It's a problem-solving approach to determining strategies to support students rather than a prescriptive approach. It looks like a menu from a restaurant. It kind of is similar. So if I was planning it with a group of teachers and we talked about the barriers to learning for a group of students, we would go up and have a look. Um, the way the framework is, it gives us ideas of how we can overcome those barriers rather than specific approaches. So the way that the framework is, it's divided into three principles. Principle one, that I engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways. Principle two, when I'm thinking about the content descriptors, I represent them multiple ways. And principle three, when the students are demonstrating their achievement standards, they can do it in multiple ways, but it's not a free for all. It's a more targeted way of doing that. Within each one of these principles, each of these rectangles is called a guideline. It's a more specific way of overcoming those barriers to the learning process. And within each guideline, there are dot points. They're checkpoints, they're targeted ways to overcome their barriers to the learning process, but they're not strategies and they're not as prescriptive as strategies. For example, if we look at this one, optimize individual choice and autonomy, that's not a strategy, that's a way of thinking about what I might do. We'll have a look a little bit more detail at it, and then we'll have a look at how we can apply it. So this is the broad definition of universal design from learning from the nationally consistent collection of data. But fundamentally, it is about considering the needs of all learners from the beginning and creating that flexible approach to teaching. It gives an example of subtitles, but that's just one of many, many things that could be done. When we plan with the Universal Design for Learning, we start by asking ourselves three questions. Am I providing my students with multiple ways of engaging in the learning process? Because we know if kids aren't engaged, they don't learn. And if they're not engaged, that can become problems in terms of behavior and other things. If we go back to that content descriptor and it talking about students also identify and explain ways that characters, settings, and events, when combined, create meaning in narratives. If we know our kids, we can choose narratives that engage them because the Australian curriculum is not as prescriptive as that, but it's thinking about what narratives would engage my class. The second question I think about when I'm planning and talking about the content descriptors here, am I representing the knowledge and skills in the approved curriculum to my students in multiple ways? So thinking about, do I always do it the same way? And if I always do it that same way, what kids am I missing? Versus how could I represent that knowledge and those skills in many different ways? And the last question I ask myself is, am I allowing my students to provide evidence of learning against the achievement standards in multiple ways? And it's really important part of that is defining the cognitive verbs and key terminology in that achievement standard and thinking about what it is students are required to demonstrate and not demonstrate. And we'll have a look at that a little bit later in the S part of the model. So this is the framework. So 3 principles. I engage the kids in the learning process in multiple ways. Then I demonstrate the knowledge and skills in the content descriptors in multiple ways. And when students are demonstrating the achievement standards, they can do it in multiple ways. But it's not a free-for-all. You can just create one really good assessment task and still hit that. So let's have a look at each part of it, and then we'll have a look at how we can apply it to your students. So to engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways, we first need to recruit their interest. Have we shown them connections to their real life? Have we supported them that way? It also talks about minimizing threats and distractions, because think about if you're doing mathematics with a group of students and they're worried about being wrong, they might not give it a go. So we need to first think about how we recruited their interest. For example, coming back to that content description from English, have we chosen a novel, a narrative that's engaging for our kids? Then we support them to sustain their effort and persistence. So when things get hard, do we support them to keep on going? It talks about group work, effective feedback, things like that. Then we support them with self-regulation. So the way that the framework works is it builds down here to try to develop independent learners. So it's a hierarchy either way. So before we can have kids who can self-regulate in relation to their learning, we need to first recruit their interest, then support them to sustain the effort and persistence. Then we support them with self-regulation. If kids struggle with self-regulation, rather than hammering it home, we need to ask ourselves, have I supported them to sustain the effort and persistence in the learning process? If they can't do this, have I recruited their interest in the learning process? So it can go either way. So when we come to principle 2, the first part is, can all kids physically access the information being taught? If I talk at kids all the time, and some kids have receptive language difficulties and don't understand what they hear, then obviously, or not all kids can physically access the information. So the first question I have to ask is, can all kids physically access the information? For example, in mathematics, especially version 9, talks a lot about concrete materials. So using that concrete materials ensures that all kids can physically access that information. Once all kids can physically access that information, clarified all the language and symbol used in that information, whether it be a text or something else. Then I support students with comprehension. Once again, it's a hierarchy. We want kids to be able to supported to be able to do comprehension. If they struggle with comprehension, rather than hammering this home, come back and ask yourself, have I clarified all language and symbols? If students struggle to understand the language and symbol used in the text, can they physically access it? Remember, these aren't specific strategies, but they're ways of thinking about how we support our students to access that learning process. What I like about the Universal Design for Learning framework is this gives you ideas, but then I can choose the strategies I want to use. When it comes to principle 3 around the achievement standards and students demonstrating them, have I allowed kids to physically demonstrate what they can do first? So talking it out, designing something, drawing something, physically demonstrating what they can do, then supporting them with expression and communication, writing it up, then supporting students with executive functioning, learning goals, those sort of things. So if kids struggle to set goals and make determinations how they're going, have I supported them to write up their understanding? If they're struggling with writing, can they physically demonstrate it? Think about ourselves as adults. If I asked you to do something that was physical, are you better at physically doing it or writing it up? It's the same sort of thing in the classroom. How can kids physically demonstrate it first, then do it? So the UDL framework is a problem-solving approach. Each one of those dot points just gives us ideas of how to overcome those barriers to learning. So if I come back to my whole class, my common characteristics, my strengths, my associated barriers to learning, I can think about the UDL framework and I can take dot points. But notice when you look at those dot points, they're very broad, sometimes a bit wishy-washy, but they just simply help me think about what possible strategies I might use. So we're going very broad and we're starting to narrow it down. Now, I think about what are my common characteristics, what are my strengths, what are my barriers to learning, and then I identify strategies that I could actually use within my classroom in that tier 1. So if we look here, for MC, JT, and LD, they have difficulties comprehending the meaning of text, struggle to understand what written questions are asking. I could supplement all written text with concrete materials and visual images. So I've thought about what are my common characteristics, what are the strengths associated with those common characteristics for all the kids in my class, what are the barriers to learning, then I've identified strategies. I include this column here, but it's something you can leave out. So what I want you to do now, come back to your table. I want you to add one more column for strategies. And I'm going to give you 10 minutes to think about what are some potential strategies that you could use in your classroom to support your students to access the learning process. Remember, call out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll turn my mic and camera off and I'll put the timer on. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. See you soon. All right, everyone, let's come back. Now that we've looked at the strengths and barriers to learning for our whole class, we actually now need to start thinking about our students, individual students with disability and diverse learning needs. So we're moving into that tier 2 and tier 3 space. So we're going to do exactly the same as we did for our whole class, but we're going to think about individual student now. So if we have a look at an example here for an individual student, doesn't understand when and how to interact in social situations, hypersensitive to loud noises, difficulties with receptive language, disorganized and restricted interest in Minecraft. We're going to do the same process as we did for the whole class, but we're going to do this for those individual students. So we'll look at what are the individual strengths, high levels of visual literacy, and detailed knowledge of all elements of the Minecraft world. And we move into barriers to learning. So we map it out the same, but this time individual students we're thinking about rather than the whole class, individual student strength and individual barriers to learning or functional impacts. So in the first instance, when we were looking at universal design for learning, we're looking at those strategies that we're going to use for everyone. Now we're moving into that space of differentiated instruction where we think about instructional adjustments, curriculum adjustments, and environmental adjustments. So we go back to our individual student characteristic, individual strength, and individual students' barriers to learning, and we look at the instructional adjustments that we'll use for that student. Remembering that this is where we can be a bit discerning and not overcomplicate our work is when we think about these instructional adjustments, if they're the strategies that we're already using at tier 1, we don't need to replicate them because we're already using them. So in this case, our instructional adjustments column will only have things that are different than that we're using for everyone. Then we move into our environmental adjustments and our curriculum adjustments. And we're talking about connections here to Minecraft, but we're also needing to map our student against the achievement standards from foundation to year 10. So if our student is working at a different year level, either above or below, we need to map them to work out where to target, and we'll have a look at the next stage of the case model. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'm going to get you to draw up a table and think about an individual student with disability or diverse learning needs within your classroom. And I want you to give this a go. You know, I've got 5 rows here, but you don't need to have 5. You could have 2. It's up to you how many rows you have. I've just broken them up to show people how it is and how it works. And so think about the individual student strength, individual barriers to learning. Then what are the instructional adjustments, environmental adjustments, and curriculum adjustments that you might use for the student? Remembering that in this space here, if you've already got them in your universal strategies for everyone, that students are already accessing them. You don't need to do it a second time. So here's going to be different to what is in your universal or tier 1 strategies. I'll give you 10 minutes. Remember, call out if you need anything. I'll put the timer on and I'll come back in 10. I'll leave this up so you can see. Few minutes and we'll come back together.